Okay, let's just jump right into it. In the dead of night, January 3rd, 2026, something huge happened in the skies over Caracas. It was an event that would literally redraw the political map of the entire Western Hemisphere. Today, we're breaking down the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. And it didn't take long for the White House to respond. Just hours after the raid, this was the message from President Donald Trump. He wasn't just framing this as an arrest, you see. This was a statement, a fundamental reassertion of American influence right in its own backyard. It really set the stage for a massive international showdown.
So here's what actually went down. It was fast. Really fast. Around 2 in the morning local time, U.S. forces descended on Maduro's residence, which was inside a major military base. Maduro and his wife were taken into custody and immediately flown straight to an Air National Guard base in New York to face a whole slate of charges: narcoterrorism, drug trafficking, corruption, the works.
And of course, a mission this big had a name: Operation Absolute Resolve. And let me be clear, this was not some last-minute decision. Nope. This was a meticulously planned operation, the climax of years of escalating tensions and very careful strategic positioning. I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this thing. We're talking about pretty much every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, plus intelligence agencies, all working in concert. It kicked off with targeted airstrikes to basically neutralize Venezuela's air defenses, which cleared the way for the special ops teams, including Delta Force, to hit the ground. And if you want a number that really puts this into perspective, how about this? 150. That's how many U.S. aircraft were involved. That's everything from F-22 Raptors and F-35 stealth jets to B-1 bombers, helicopters, you name it. The U.S. military brought overwhelming force to make absolutely sure this mission did not fail.
Okay, so how did we even get here? Well, this definitely didn't happen in a vacuum. You really have to look at the last few months of 2025 to see how the pressure was being ramped up, step by step, on Venezuela.
And when you lay it all out, you can see a really clear pattern emerge. It starts with this so-called anti-narcotics campaign that led to some deadly encounters at sea. Then the CIA gets the green light for covert ops. After that comes a massive military deployment called Southern Spear. And the final move? An economic blockade, hitting Venezuela where it hurts the most, its oil exports. Each step was a deliberate turn of the screw. So what was the official justification?
Well, the Trump administration gave a pretty powerful economic argument, and it's one that goes way back. President Trump basically argued that when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry back in the 70s, it amounted to a massive theft of what were originally American-built assets. So, in his telling, this was about reclaiming stolen property.
And this is where you get two stories that just don't line up at all. On one side, you have the U.S. presenting its actions as a legitimate fight against narco-terrorism and a move to protect its own interests. But on the other hand, the Venezuelan government condemned it as pure imperialist aggression, a blatant attempt at regime change, and they called on the UN Security Council to step in.
But to really get what's going on here, we have to zoom out. We've got to go back even further. Because this whole conflict, it's all tangled up in a century of disputes over oil, foreign intervention, and this one big overarching idea in American foreign policy.
It all comes down to oil. See, the very thing that made Venezuela so incredibly wealthy was also its biggest vulnerability. The oil boom back in the 70s flooded the country with cash, creating this huge middle class and funding massive social programs. But it also made the entire country's economy dependent on just one thing. And that dependency eventually became a curse. When oil prices crashed in the decades that followed, all that prosperity just evaporated. The government had to borrow a ton of money, social spending got slashed, poverty exploded, and the whole political system, which was built on handing out oil money, just started to crumble. Okay, so let's talk about the ideological foundation here. The idea that's kind of been lurking in the background of U.S. actions in this region for a long, long time. It's called the Donroe Doctrine. It's from way back in 1823, and it basically says the Americas are America's sphere of influence, and it's been used to justify interventions all across Latin America for 200 years. And President Trump, he didn't shy away from this history at all. In fact, he leaned right into it. He called the operation an application of the Donroe Doctrine, his own little spin on it. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was about making sure U.S. dominance in the region would never be questioned again. So, as you can probably guess, an action this dramatic set off a firestorm of reactions all over the world. People were not on the same page. The fallout was immediate, and it was intense.
Let's start with the very real human cost. We know at least 55 military personnel were confirmed killed. And here's a really key detail. 32 of them were actually Cuban armed forces and intelligence members. That just goes to show you how deep Cuba's support for the Maduro regime really ran. On top of that, civilian deaths were estimated to be as high as 80. But for the millions of Venezuelans, nearly 8 million of them, who had already fled the country's collapse, this news was a reason to celebrate. I mean, in places like Doral, Florida, which is basically Little Caracas, and in cities like Santiago and Lima, people were pouring into the streets. For them, this was liberation.
At the same time, though, it was a totally different scene elsewhere. You had loyalists protesting in Caracas, and in New York City, people were chanting, "No blood for oil." And internationally, the divide was just as sharp. Russia and China, longtime allies of Venezuela, condemned the act. But several of Venezuela's neighbors cautiously supported it, hoping it would finally bring some stability to the region.
And that same division, it was happening right inside the United States. A Reuters poll that came out right after the raid showed the American public was split perfectly into thirds. A third approved, a third disapproved, and a third just weren't sure what to think. Absolutely no national consensus on this. And the criticism wasn't just coming from protesters on the street. Some pretty big institutions had some very strong words. The New York Times editorial board, for example, flat out condemned the operation. They called it dangerous and illegal and said it could unleash total chaos in Venezuela. So, all of this leads us to the biggest question of all. What happens now? With Maduro gone, Venezuela is at this massive crossroads. And according to the experts, the path forward is, well, it's complicated and it's full of some really tough challenges. First off, let's just talk about the money. The cost to rebuild this country is just mind-blowing. We're talking more than $20 billion with a B, and that's just to get the collapsed oil industry back on its feet. So any new government is facing a monumental economic task from day one. So what could that future actually look like? Well, analysis from the Atlantic Council boils it down to three main possibilities. Best case, a smooth U.S.-managed transition to a new, friendly government. But what if that doesn't happen? You could see the country fall into a long, drawn-out internal conflict, with armed groups fighting back. And that could lead to the third scenario, a long-term, costly U.S. occupation just to keep the peace. So that's where we're left. With the leader captured and an entire nation in chaos, we have to ask, is this the moment that finally sets Venezuela on a new democratic path? Or did this just kick open Pandora's box, starting a new, unpredictable, and maybe even more violent chapter in the nation's troubled history?